This is episode 43 of the Relentless Man podcast, Heart to Heart. Yeah, so it's been a lot of fun making these episodes and working with you. And obviously I can't know about you, but I have learned a lot as a result of making these episodes. And at least one of the basic things that the podcast episodes have been able to help me attain is the realization that, well, basically to clarify what the human problems are. And ultimately, it seems to boil down to, well, so we think we have a lot of problems, but it appears they're not that many. For example, we have problems about, well, will we get employed or not? We have problems about, well, will we find the right relationship or not? We have problems about maybe how we're going to raise our children. Where is the money going to come from? What if we lose the house? What if we don't succeed and fail, etc.? If you look at these problems, they appear to be different, but you look carefully and you realize they're just a few things that are happening here. There's really the core thing, for example, is just fear. Fear of the future, for instance, is fear of what is not known. That could tell you about so many of the problems you have could be just classified as fear. Right? Is, oh, well, am I going to get a job or not? Well, you're afraid. You don't know whether or not you'll be able to get a job. That's fear of the future, fear of the unknown. Well, you're not sure if this relationship is going to work or not. Again, fear of the unknown. You're wondering what will happen to you when you get fired. Once again, fear. Or you don't know if you're going to attain something. Well, that's again, right? That's again a source of fear. That's again caused by just fear. Okay. And obviously fear is not the only problem, but we have things like desire, right? Usually when we're disappointed, it's because we expected something, right? So again, this might disguise itself in many ways, but it's really a question of having expectations and the expectations not being met. Okay. So really, if you think about it carefully, you realize that what really causes all of our suffering and problems is certain base human emotions, if you like. There's fear, there's anger, there's anxiety, right? There's depression. All those are like the really core problems. The other ones are just external manifestations of them. Let's say uh, you're going to get fired. You may get fired, and that's a problem. If you look deeply enough, it's not really about getting fired. It's more maybe you don't know what's going to happen to you after you get fired. There's that fear. Maybe if you get fired, you go home, your relationship might end. Maybe, I don't know, your girlfriend or boyfriend may dump you because you don't have money. But those are all just fears, or at least it's just you're struggling with expectations. You don't know what to expect from the future, right? So really, what I realized when working on this podcast was that before the focus was on these much more external problems that we have. Well, how to succeed, how to learn a skill, how to realize your potential. Okay, so those are all well and good, but they're not really the core of the problem. And once I realized that, now I had to shift to tackling really what matters to you, right? And really tackling things like, well, fear, right? Why is it that you're making bad decisions? Could it be because you're not observing the world correctly? So we thought about observation, those sorts of problems. But again, so this is a good layer. That is, we've realized, okay, most of the problems we have are faced are based on what is called human nature. Anger, greed, fear, desire, expectation, those sorts of things. And so that seems like we've gotten the root cause of the problem, but still we haven't. Because if you go a little deeper, you realize that, well, where does fear come from? Where does hate come from? Where does greed come from? Where does our expectations of the future come from? Well, if you look carefully, you realize it's thought. Right? The root cause, in fact, of all our problems is thinking. I dare you to Imagine any problem you have right now that can't be traced to the fact that you're thinking. If you don't think about something, how can it be a problem? So, for instance, again, you don't, this again is another thing, is that I really can't tell you what to do, but we're really just analyzing and exploring this issue. So, well, let's think about any problem you might have, and let's see if it's not just thinking that's at the base of it. Okay, you're overweight, all right? You don't like your body. You're overweight. You can't move. You're always breathing heavily. You're panting after walking, taking 3 steps. Okay, so that's a major problem for you. You're overweight, and you may think, well, so my problem is being overweight, right? But actually, no. That's just the surface layer. If we dig deeper, we may realize that the reason you're overweight is because, well, you're eating too much. Okay. So maybe eating too much is a problem, but we look again and realize, well, why are you eating too much? Okay, well, what's behind your excessive eating? And then it might be that you're trying to find something in food. You're trying to gain some pleasure from the food, right? The food is pleasurable, and that's why you keep eating it, and you keep eating it, and hoping that the food will fulfill you. So you see, the problem is not even about food; it's about fulfillment. You're miserable right now. You're depressed. You're sad. And you think that the way to get out of your sadness, the way to solve your problems is to eat, to be happy, because you think you've associated food with happiness, right? And that would become the core of that would appear to be the root cause of the problem. The reason you're overweight is because you're unhappy and you're trying to find happiness in food. But again, this is nice try, but it's still not, it still doesn't really go to the root, to the core, to the heart of the problem. Because, well, okay, why are you trying to find happiness in the food, right? If we look carefully, we realize it's really a thought process that you have. You've somehow thought that food will make you happy, or part of the problem is that you're thinking that you're miserable right now. Okay, the other thing is you're thinking that the next bite of whatever it is that you're eating is going to bring you happiness. These are all thoughts. And these thoughts are really what is causing all of your suffering, what is causing you to eat more than you need to. For instance, and we're not saying this is the solution, but suppose you decided to, suppose you stopped thinking that you're miserable, or you stopped thinking that food is going to make you happy. Let's say you really stopped thinking like that. Well, why would you eat more than you need? You'd just eat, and then you'd feel some aches in your belly indicating that you've eaten quite a lot, and you just stop eating. But it's really faulty thinking here. I don't know if that's making any sense to you. When you lose a loved one, what causes the depression, the sadness over the loss? It's because of the keyword there is loss. You're thinking about the loss, right? You're thinking about how, well, they're not going to be there again. The things you used to do with them, you'll never be able to do with them. Maybe you said some nasty shit to the person before the person died, and now you're feeling guilty for what you said to them, right? This is, again, the problem is thinking here, right? So what are we? Are we recommending that you shouldn't think? No. This is, thinking is not the enemy, right? So the thing is that thinking is more of, it's really a powerful tool, right? And part of why we've been able to thrive as humans is because of our ability to think, right? The reason we've been able to dominate animals that are stronger, faster, perhaps even more deadly than us was because we're able to outthink them, right? Thinking is the reason why we have technology, right? Thinking is the reason why you're able to listen to this podcast right now. People wrote code, they thought up how to make the phone work, they thought up how to record the human voice electronically, how to transmit information. So thinking is a useful tool, clearly, right? Our lives would be radically different if we didn't have thinking, right? So the problem is not, we're not saying thinking is the enemy, no. But we're saying that, here's what we're really saying, is that thinking, one thing I've realized is that thinking is just a tool. Thinking is like a knife, it's a tool. A knife is neither good nor bad. You use the knife badly, and, well, you're now harming people. You use the knife well, and you're saving lives, perhaps as a doctor with your scalpel, right? Um, and that's really the nature of a tool. It's like your hand, right? Is your hand good or bad? We think about it. Well, look, you could use your hand to punch people, in which case you've used the tool badly, or you could use your hand to, I don't know, carry a baby. Okay, well, now you've used the tool correctly. So the tool itself, the hand is neither good nor bad. It's what you do with it, right? Just like a gun. A gun is not good or bad. A gun is not going to shoot itself, right? If you decide to use the gun to shoot people, then you have a problem, right? If you use the gun maybe to practice hand-eye coordination, maybe it's not a problem anymore, right? So why are we bringing this up? Thoughts and our intelligence, our mind is the same way. It's a tool. It's thinking is just a tool, okay? It's neither good nor bad. If we use thinking correctly, well, okay, we accomplish things, right? If we use thinking incorrectly, if we don't know how to use thought, then thought begins to master us. It's kind of like if you know how to swim and you're in the water, well, the water could be a positive experience for you. It gives you enjoyment of swimming and exploring your body and exercising. But if you don't know how to swim, then the water is your enemy. It's drowning you. It's really literally threatening your life. And that is the problem. That's what's happening with thought as well, our thoughts. Because thinking, which is this powerful tool that can enable us to do things, is also literally killing us. It's driving us nuts, if you think about it. You could just sit down, like, comfortably in a chair, completely at peace, and then you start thinking. And you think about how miserable your life is, how you'll never be anything, how you're a worthless piece of shit. And within a few seconds, your mood has changed completely. Maybe even you're contemplating suicide, right? That's how detrimental thought can be, right? It could be a nice tool, but also it has these other effects where it could literally drive you to take your own life. And people have done it. We've seen it. Unfortunately, we've seen it a lot, right? It's a major problem. We've seen it with college students, for instance. A guy is, let's say, not doing well in school. They're not able to successfully finish their assignments. They failed a couple of tests. They think to themselves, my future is over. This is the end of it. Right? And then they suddenly come to the insight, right? Insight in quotation marks, that the way to end all this suffering is to just die, kill yourself, right? That again is an example of intelligence, thought working against us. And really, if you think about all the human problems we have, all the things that cause us misery, it's just thought working against us. When you're depressed, well, you're thinking about certain stuff that are making you depressed. If you're happy, well, you think about certain stuff that are making you happy, etc. Right? So, now that, I don't know if you buy this idea, please, again, don't take my word for it. Just observe your own suffering and misery and see whether your misery is not really the direct consequence of your thoughts. Think about any negative emotions that you experience. Are they the result of your thoughts about things? Okay. So, really, what we're saying here what we appear to be saying is that if one had control over one's thoughts, if you could control your thoughts, then really there should be no reason for you to ever be depressed, right? For you to ever be sad or miserable. Okay. Again, in our society today, we've really what we've been taught is people talk about stress management. We talk about coping with pain, etc., coping with suffering. And usually when we say that, what we have assumed is that pain and suffering are, okay, physical pain is different. Let's just talk about the other forms of suffering: depression, fear, anger, jealousy, envy, those sorts of things. We've kind of come to the conclusion that those sorts of things are things that suffering is the sort of thing that we can't, for example, stress is something that we can't, that is a fact of life, and all we need to do is kind of just minimize it. That's why we talk about stress management, isn't it? Is we're trying to minimize stress. That's why we talk about anger management, dealing with anger, keeping your anger at a minimum. Because when we say that, we've given up on the idea that anger can be eradicated, that we've given up on the idea that it's possible for someone to not be angry anymore. we've given up on the idea that it's possible for someone to not be depressed anymore. That it's possible for you to not, even if someone says stuff to you, not to be insulted. We've given up on that idea. And part of what we've been working on the podcast is, why have we given up on these ideas? How do we know that anger is inevitable? How do we know that jealousy is inevitable? How do we know that it's impossible to become the sort of person that can never be stressed out? Why have we given up on these things? Why have we accepted suffering as something that is just a fact of life for us, and all we need to do is to minimize it? That's part of what the podcast has been trying to tackle. Right? In particular, asking questions about, well, is it possible to not be stressed? Is it possible to not be angry? Is it possible to just be the sort of person? Forget about controlling anger. Controlling anger means you're still angry, but you're controlling it. Think about something else here. Imagine becoming the sort of person who, even when people say shit about you, you just don't become angry. Okay? It's not that you're controlling your anger. You're not angry at all. Okay? That is becoming the sort of person who is happy, in a sense, right? Who is at peace regardless of what's happening externally. That is, if you're poor, you're still at peace. If you get a promotion, you're still at peace. If someone smiles at you, you're at peace. If they frown at you, you're at peace. If you get a new girlfriend, you're at peace. If your girlfriend dumps you, you're still at peace. That is getting to the point where suffering is just non-existent for you. That is, it's something that you have tackled internally. That is, your state of your happiness or your well-being no longer depends on the external world. Right? So that's really what we've been thinking about, because from that position, you could do pretty much anything. Right? Think about the energy that goes into, again, so I guess before we even go there, one thing to remember is that, look, I'm no expert at these things, okay? I'm trying to figure them out as well. Right? So right now, what I've shared with you so far are the things that I know. For instance, I've noticed that my suffering is self-inflicted. It's always the source, is always the, how's it called, the result of my thinking. And I've also interacted with people, and I've seen people suffer. And when I dig deep, I realize, again, it was their thoughts. So that's one thing I'm sure about, is that our thinking is really causing our suffering, okay? That I know. But whether it is possible to not suffer anymore, that is, to become the sort of person whose well-being is no longer determined by the external world, that I don't know if it's possible. Hence the podcast, hence the investigations. Okay, that I really don't know. Okay, and but I'm investigating it every single day. And I do have some ideas, but ultimately I don't know yet. Okay, so but one thing I'm not going to do, and I hope you don't do as well, is just because everybody has told you, oh yeah, stress is a fact of life, you're always going to suffer, there's nothing you can do about it, you're always going to be comparing yourself with others. Whenever someone does a job better than you, you're always going to be miserable. You're always going to have jealousy. I'm not going to just accept those things because people in society have told me that that's how things should be. I hope you don't accept them as well. It's really problematic to just take things because people have said them to you. That is, because someone has never been able to be free of anger, they're telling you that you can't be free of anger. Just because someone is always comparing themselves with others, they're telling you you also always have to be comparing yourself with others. Just because someone is miserable and they're telling you that, look, you'll always be miserable, doesn't mean you should believe them. So really what this podcast is, and this is what we've been doing, is genuinely going into these questions, trying to find out for ourselves whether really there is no end to suffering, right? And obviously, also at the same time, questions about self-discovery. Who am I? Really, truly answering that question, right? Because the many explanations we have for who am I are not really correct. They're like explanations that are like, your name is not who you are, right? Your name is just something that someone gave you, right? You existed before they even gave you a name. Your physical appearance clearly is not who you are either. Your physical appearance changes and you're still there. Right? Or your story. People tell you, oh, this is, you were born here and blah, 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 and you're a man, etc. All these are stories that people tell you, but there's something more to you than these stories, right? So that's another important question. Who am I? And it appears that if you answer the question, who am I? Answering that question truly also appears to be the end of pain, the end of suffering, right? I mean, you'll experience physical pain for sure. Someone stabs you, you'll feel it. But suffering, that appears to be a choice. And it seems to be rooted in knowing who one truly is. Right? So again, these questions seem different. Suffering, the end of thought, the end of fear, freedom, and then there is identity. Who am I? They seem to be different questions, but my own investigation seems to come to the conclusion that these questions are actually one and the same. If you are free from suffering, you also know who you are. If you know who you are, you're also free from suffering. But again, this has not been experienced, so do not take my word for it. This is the sort of thing that we need to investigate. It's just what I think, but I don't know yet. But really, that seems to be the beginning of understanding, not knowing. Right? Because if we know, then how can we ever find anything out? Right? If you're going to perform an investigation, but you already know what you're going to find, then why are you doing the investigation in the first place, right? So if I start by saying that, look, I know that stress is can't be eradicated. I already know that stress can only be managed. If I start from that point of view, how can I ever find anything different from the conclusion I've already drawn, right? So that's why I want to keep an open mind here and understand these things. And so we've been looking at thought again, and we're saying that thought is really the root cause of all of our problems, really. And that's why, and one way to see this is also like, if you change your thoughts, you automatically change like your physiology sometimes. So for instance, if you sit down and you think about beautiful, awesome things, you begin to feel good and awesome. If you think about how horrible your life is, you begin to feel horrible. If you think about someone in one way, you feel good about them. If you think about someone in a different way, you feel bad about them. Right? So at least one thing we know is that this is something you can try even now, is if you shift your thoughts, it changes automatically how you're feeling and how you treat others. If you're feeling miserable, if you're thinking about miserable things, you begin to feel miserable and you treat others in a miserable way. If you're thinking about things, if you're thinking positive stuff, well, you feel positive and you treat people positively. Right? But so then the question becomes, well, isn't just the solution to this whole thinking problem just changing our thoughts to positive thoughts? Yeah, I used to believe that. I really don't believe that anymore, because those positive thoughts are usually, I don't know if they really solve the problem per se. Okay, so let's say you're not doing well at work, right? And you realize that part of your thinking has been that you're a poor, you're just not smart enough. Okay, that's what you've been believing. You're not smart enough, and that's why you've not been doing a great job at work. So you realize that, and then you change your thoughts to, I'm really smart, I'm really capable, right? And from there, you decide, suddenly it's possible, if you really act in accordance with that belief, well, obviously, the environment around you is going to start shifting. Okay, you're going to perhaps be pushing more. You're going to be giving up much later. Maybe before you're giving up too quickly, you're going to give up less. You're going to begin to behave differently because you've changed your thought. Your thought is, look, I'm a capable guy. You begin to act like a capable guy would act. Okay, so yes, that will change your external environment for sure. If you really change your thoughts and try to act in accordance with the new thought that you've come up with, of I'm a smart guy, well, yes, things will begin to happen. Your environment definitely will change. This is one of the things that I know actually. Right? That means that I've experienced this myself. I've experienced a shift in my performance in society due to a shift in thinking. So that I know, but don't take my word for it. Experience it for yourself. However, one thing I noticed though was that when you shift your thinking, you really haven't solved the core problem. Okay? So when let's say before you were saying to yourself, look, I'm just dumb, right? You were feeling, the problem was a feeling of worthlessness, right? That was perhaps the core problem, is that you're feeling worthless, and that's why you're feeling dumb and not doing a good job at work. And now you've shifted your thoughts to, I'm really smart, okay? But you see, you're not stupid. What that means is that even when you say to yourself and repeat yourself in the mirror, I'm really smart, I'm really smart, I'm really smart, there's a part of you that knows this is just made up, okay? There's an inner critic in all of us that doubts things, right? So you say, I'm smart, I'm smart, I'm smart. You repeat it in the mirror. A part of you is like, yeah, is this really true? Right? And so now, sure, your external environment has changed. You're doing better at work, but deep down, you're still afraid. You're afraid that maybe this is just a facade. Maybe your beliefs are not correct. That maybe when the pressure is on, you're going to do a poor job. You're still in fear, you see. So before you're feeling worthless and afraid that you don't mean much, and now you've shifted yourself to just being afraid that you might not succeed, you see. But ultimately, you haven't solved the problem. You're still miserable. Your external environment looks different, but you're still miserable, okay? So, and I mean, we've seen this before, right? It's like really smart people, people who have a lot of money, right? Externally, they seem to be successful and doing well, but if you look at them carefully, you realize, look, they're just as miserable as the rest of us, okay? They're always fighting, they're always angry, they're always frowning, they're always depressed. Perhaps even a bunch of them can't sleep at night, right? So really, they can't be a success, can they, right? So they have different thoughts, they change their thoughts, but they're still miserable. This doesn't get to the root cause of our problem, which is human misery, human suffering, right? And ultimately, one is not truly realizing one's potential, right? Because this podcast is about dying empty, isn't it? Realizing your true potential, becoming yourself, uh, having, doing something important in the world. That is making a contribution to the world, making the human race better, right? But ultimately, it's hard to do these things if you're miserable. That's the problem, isn't it? If you're miserable, how are you going to do these things? How are you going to improve the world if you yourself if you've not been able to improve yourself? How are you going to make people happy if you are miserable? How are you going to perform at your best, to the best of your ability, if you're miserable? That's really hard to do, right? So ultimately, dying empty, one way to view it is the end of misery, the end of suffering. How to do that is the major question. But one thing we're beginning to see, and that's another thing I've noticed, is that thinking is not going to solve the problems of thought. Okay, that feels kind of self-evident, right? It's like thinking is what caused the misery in the first place. How is thinking going to solve the misery? And the mind is very illusory and very tricky. The mind could really try to offer solutions, but those solutions are not really solutions. Like, for instance, what we are talking about before is you had thoughts about, oh, I'm worthless, whatever, and then you change your thoughts to, I have a lot of worth, but you're still afraid that you may be worthless, right? Sure, you're thinking, your mind tried to solve the problem for you by changing your thoughts, but ultimately the thoughts led you into more misery, okay? So it appears that thinking is not the solution. Thinking is just, dude, just try once, right? Like, you know what? Maybe I'll give you a more personal example just to bring this out. There's this time I just decided to really pay attention to my thinking, just observe the thinking, okay, and just follow the thought process, wherever it leads me. And I'd never realized before, but I'm actually insane, completely nuts and bananas. Right? It's like there are a bunch of thoughts going on in the head. They're not really connected. Talking about one thing, then talking about another, then just complete. It's really miserable, dude. Like, have you ever seen like what would refer to as an insane person? That is, especially the ones that speak out loud. So you just meet someone and they're, let's say, nuts, and they're on the street and they're just talking to themselves all the time, and you look at them and you're like, wow, god damn, that guy is so messed up, right? What's the key feature of an insane person? Well, one thing is usually they're incoherent, right? They're talking about one idea. Maybe they're talking about the weather. Then in the next phrase, they're talking about the land. And the other phrase, they're talking about, I don't know, what happened to them. And then they're talking about some tree. They're always just, their thoughts are so chaotic, right? It's like, they're completely incoherent. It's unclear how one idea connects to another, why the idea is even coming up in the first place, what triggered them. They're just impossible to follow, right? And these people we call insane. Now let's ask this question. Suppose we attach a megaphone to your thoughts. That is, if we decided to broadcast the thoughts that go on in your mind, would you really be different from these insane people on the street? The so-called people we're calling insane. Right. Phrase is insane. Right. And if you pay attention to your thoughts, this is again something that I know actually. But what I mean by that is something that I've experienced. And I paid attention to my thoughts and I realized I was actually nuts. I was indistinguishable from the mad person on the street. The only difference was that no one can hear my thoughts except me. Right? So that was the only difference. But I was as insane. I am as insane as that person. Right? And so clearly, well, these thoughts are not helping me. The thoughts are not going to solve the problem for me. In fact, the thoughts are really not going to solve the problem for you either. Are very unlikely. Maybe you'll come up with a new revolution, but no. Thoughts cause the problem. Thoughts are not going to solve it. So we need something else. And that is the question. How can we tackle thought? How can we turn thought into a tool? Right? That is, and this is key again. So, and this is a realization that is really important because your thoughts are just a tool. They help you to communicate. They're like a knife, as we said before. A knife is just a tool. It's neither good nor bad. Your thoughts are just a tool. They're neither good nor bad. Your thoughts can help you or your thoughts can hinder you. Right now, you're suffering, which means your thoughts are working against you. But who is in control? You or your thoughts? Right? So, is it possible to treat your mind and thoughts purely as a tool? Is the question. Right? So, is it possible for you to have the relationship with your mind that you have with your hand? Right? Unless, of course, if you're not having any issues with your hand, well, if your hand's functioning correctly, what that means is that you're able to do whatever you like with your hand, right? If you want to grab something, you grab it. If you want to clench your fists, you clench your fists. If you want to keep your hand on the table, you keep your hand on the table. If you want to move your hand around, you move it around. If your hand is doing what you want it to do, you're said to be in control of your hand, and you're doing well. The hand is useful to you. Right? Why not do the same thing with the mind as well? The mind is part of you, isn't it? Right? So, how can we get to the point where we have as much control with our thoughts as we have with our hand? That is, if you want to think, you think. If you don't want to think, you stop thinking. Your thoughts become a tool that serve you, kind of like your hand. Right? It's, if you want to move away from fire, your hand moves away from fire. If you want to touch something, you touch something. Your hands are working for you, right? Not against you. Your hands are merely a tool that you control. Right? But with thoughts, it's a little different, right? Partly because we can't see the thoughts, I guess, but ultimately, our thoughts have become erratic, right? If your thoughts are depressing and you can't sleep, if your thoughts are causing you depression, right? If your thoughts are making you miserable, then something's wrong. Can we get to the point where we can use our thoughts as a tool? Right? That's the key question. Right? Can you get to the point where if someone insults you, you register, you listen to what they're saying, but you have such control over your mind that it's completely up to you whether or not to get upset. Can we get to the point where maybe you lose a loved one and it's completely up to you whether or not you become depressed or go into deep grief? Right? Can we get to that point? Right? Can you use your mind purely as a tool? Right? That is, you turn it on when you need to think. Let's say right now we're having a conversation, right? We're talking about important issues. Right now, I need my thoughts. I need my mind in order to, explain these ideas and use the language. Now the mind is working correctly because at this moment, at least, not always, but at this moment, at least I have control over it. It's doing precisely what I want it to do. It's saying what I want it to say. It's explaining what I want it to explain. Right? Now, for me, the problem comes when I'm not engaged in an activity like this, making a podcast, thinking about math, when I just have to sit down, right? And I don't need to use the mind. I don't need to be thinking anymore. I just need to chill, for instance. Or when I'm in bed and I just need to sleep. It's not time to think about anything. And suddenly the mind goes berserk, starts to remind me of what I haven't done, what might happen, what could happen, about ghosts, etc. And trouble, right? Can we get to the point where the mind is purely a tool, right? Because that seems to be really the core of solving our problems. It also seems to be the core of dying empty, by the way, right? Because imagine, right? Imagine for a second if you had complete control over your mind. You think when you want to think. When you don't want to think, you don't think, right? Imagine how much more efficiently you'll be able to do anything that you do, right? Maybe you're negotiating a deal and you're feeling very nervous, right? If you have complete control of your mind, then you shouldn't be feeling nervous. Imagine how much better you can perform if you're not feeling nervous, okay? You're in a situation that's scary, but you have control over your mind, in which case you're able to not be afraid. How much better will you be able to perform then? Is it clear why realizing your true potential and dying empty is intimately tied to your mind, having control over your mind? That is, instead of your thoughts controlling you, you're controlling your thoughts. But how to control your thoughts is a tricky problem. How to go beyond thinking is another critical problem. It's not an easy one to solve. At least it's, many people struggle with it. I'm struggling with it, but that's part of what we're doing in this podcast episodes, is to really delve deep into this problem and try to tackle it and see if we can't have the same relationship with our mind that we have with our hands and other body parts that we have control over. Right? And obviously here, when we talk about control, we're not talking about really fighting. Like, if someone has to, we're not talking about control with force, right? Control with force is obviously, again, another problem. It's like, imagine, let's say, like, imagine a parent who's like always trying to control the children, yelling at them, telling them to sit down, right? When you look at such a parent, do you ever think they're in control? Right? Why not? Right? The basic question, right, is if you have to yell at your children to get them to do something, how can you be in control of them? Right? If you're in control of them, why would you ever need to yell to them? Why wouldn't you just tell them to sit down and they sit down? Or maybe just give them a look and they sit down, right? So the very fact that one needs to use force is a sign of lack of control, is one way to view it, right? And so when we're talking about controlling your thoughts here, we're not talking about forceful control, right? Because if you try to force yourself, don't think, well, obviously you're thinking. If you, that's the nature of the mind, is if you try to force it to not think, it thinks more. If you try to force it to not think about something, it thinks about that thing. So when we're talking about control here, we're not talking about control with force. We're talking about the sort of control that, let's say, you have with your hand. Right? Is you're able to control your hand to make it move, but you're not in conflict with your hand. Your hand does exactly what you want it to do, and it's not fighting you. You're not fighting it. You're not pushing it to do stuff. It just does stuff. You're in sync with your hand. And that's the sort of relationship we want to have with our mind as well, where you're not controlling your thoughts, but you're in control of your thoughts. You're not fighting with them. You're controlling without force. Or we could say you're in sync with your thoughts. Anyways, we've gone on for too long here, but yeah, for some reason I just had to explain, because the series of episodes have been very bizarre, right? Sometimes I've just launched into questions and question after question for like an entire episode, and I've been interviewing people. It might be unclear what we're doing, but really this was just to give you an idea of what we're really working at here. Is we're trying to, as usual, help you die empty, right? Help you realize your true potential, right? And obviously, again, this is a different podcast because honestly, well, I don't know how to do it either, right? I'm figuring it out, right? And so what I do in this podcast is I give you what I know so far. As I figure stuff out, I tell you about it. As in questions arise, I bring up the questions, right? And the idea is that we're doing this together. I'm certainly getting better, and I hope you're getting better as well. But this is not the place to come to for the answers. Not because I don't want to give you the answers, but because I really don't know them either. Just figuring them out. But uncertainty is really where the learning begins. Right? Uncertainty makes us true explorers. Right? And I'm very glad that you've taken time to listen to this episode. And I'm glad that if you've listened to previous episodes, I'm very happy about that. And yeah, let's just work together and see if we can't tackle these human problems. If we can't end suffering, if we can't become the master of our thoughts instead of our thoughts mastering us. Let's see if we can't die empty. Thank you very much for listening to this podcast episode, and have a relentless week.